All right, take three. First rule of this channel, we do not talk about this channel. Second rule of this channel, this is not legal advice. So this is going to be the wide receiver rookie landing spot video. It's more looking at the destination than it is the actual player going there. I have Marvin Harrison Jr. up. He's probably the closest thing to a unicorn this year. He can play the X, he can play the Z, he can play the slot. So pretty much wherever he shows up, he can contribute. Overall, he's probably best as a Z being moved around the formation. The X is the guy gets like isolated, usually away. You can bully guys vertically or in press coverage. And then the slot guy, there's different types of slots. Now we have vertical slots, we have like big slots, we have like quick slots, that type of thing. But again, that guy's usually not moved around the formation to be schemed up in the same way that the Z is. If you're wondering about like when those guys talk about some of those things going on, some of the guys are going to be limited in how they're used, which means it's going to hurt their destination. If they go there, there's going to be guys that go different places and have better opportunities. So what we're looking for again is this year's Puka. He was the rookie last year to own. I can pull this up so we can talk about it. He finished as wide receiver 6 overall, I believe. And one of the things to talk about, he was a high end too. So last year we only had 5 wide receiver 1s last year. CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill, Keenan Allen, the Sun God, and Justin Jefferson at 20 points a game. After that, Puka hit 17.6. And as a high end 2, he's running all the way down to probably around DK Metcalf at 14.1 as a low end 2. Cooper Kupp being in that fringe wide receiver 3, wide receiver 2 type range. So that's what we're kind of looking at. Don't necessarily want to go out and find like this year's Jordan Addison, Zay Flowers. Those guys are going to be easier to find, but wide receiver 3s and wide receiver 2s grow on trees, and part of that is going to be like pushing the draft capital I spend on a guy down to get the higher return on investment as a Jordan Addison, Zay Flowers, that guys that can compete with wide receiver 2s at capital underneath wide receiver 3s. So again, and I bring up Garrett Wilson again, a guy who had wide receiver 1 range of outcomes, who finished as a wide receiver 3 because the quarterback situation ended up being so bad. Speaking of which, the Jets shipped Zach Wilson to the Broncos. I don't think this moves the needle on anything. Jared Stidham may be better for the toys there than Zach Wilson. If I think about anything, I will maybe do a separate video. Maybe if Zach Wilson is the starting quarterback for the Broncos next year, it's going to raise him up higher than Jarrett Stidham just because of the rushing upside. But overall, like not totally interested in that. So going back to the wide receivers, like this is what we're looking for, is that wide receiver landing spot to maximize our return. Again, I want league winners. I don't want to punt at a position. Last year, like Tank Dell at 15 points a game, the highest rookie wide receiver besides Puka that I can see. And there would have probably been a little bit more draft capital put in than Puka, but he's probably going outside of premium ranges. So again, the bigger thing is not the top end guys where they go. It's the landing spot for the guys that have the least amount of draft capital put on them. So breaking down some of the undrafted guys that sign after the draft and some of the later round guys that have some of the best opportunities, good quarterbacks and good offenses so they can put up the most points. So draft capital is actually, from a fantasy perspective, the draft capital is actually the inverse, because if we're expecting Marvin Harrison Jr. to go 4 overall to the Cardinals, everybody's going to want to compete for Marvin Harrison Jr. on their fantasy roster. That means I can't actually get Marvin Harrison Jr. outside of particular leagues where I have the right pick, as opposed to some of these guys that we can talk about. Maybe your Ricky Pearsall's, maybe your Ladd McConkey's. I like Javon Baker, maybe Jermaine Burton. Some of those guys, Luke McCaffrey, they may end up at better spots than your Marvin Harrison Jr. And it's going to cost me relatively nothing to find out, and I'm not going to be competing with anybody in my league to go get that guy. So again, that would be how I got Puka last year in the 13th round. If that's what you're looking for, that's what we're going to be talking about today. So the other thing, and I have this pulled up, is the Packers. I've been talking a lot about the Packers. They have basically 5 wide receivers and 2 tight ends, and the redundancy of their players to be able to move around their offense if guys get injured. So guys like Wicks, he can probably play like the Z. He can play the X. They might even line him up at 6'1", 206, and play like the big slot. Christian Watson, again, he can get moved and he can play like the X, the Z, probably better as a Z, but he can play the vertical slot. Jaden Reed's going to be better as a Z or a slot player. Bo Melton is probably like a slot only player. And then Romeo Dobbs, like why he was flirting around there is like high end two to low end two to high end three is because the redundancy. He can play the X, he can play the Z, he could play the slot if they really needed him to. And they're still going to have like Luke Musgrave and Tucker Kraft next year. Why this matters from a fantasy perspective is outside of spending the least amount of capital on this offense to find out there's going to be all these mouths to feed. That's a bad thing. So we want to find an offense that has a gap to fill. So when we look at Puka last year, 5th round pick, going to a good offense with Matt Stafford, Cooper Kupp goes down. There's automatically a hole for the wide receiver one in that offense, which means I can guess that he's going to be able to get in this like 120 to 150 range. And he had 160 targets last year. So that would have been outside of what I would have expected him to get. Again, I was expecting Puka to be like a mid-range wide receiver 2. He finishes a high-end wide receiver 2. I know there's going to be people out there who say, "Oh, Puka's number wide receiver 1." Not from what the stats point out. So, and then also to look at last year's guys like CeeDee Lamb's probably a Z, Tyreek Hill's a Z, Keenan Allen's probably a Z slot, can play the X. Amon-Ra, everybody knows he's a slot guy. Justin Jefferson is a Z. One of the things I want to point out is Nico Collins is probably like the first like real X, and he was finishing as wide receiver 7 last year. So again, around wide receiver 7. The Z's probably have the most value in offenses because they can get moved around the formation. That's why I talk about like Marvin Harrison Jr. And he may be the only guy that can actually get moved around the formation from a draft capital perspective. Maybe Rome. Rome probably is a little bit more of an X. Marvin Harrison is probably a little bit more of a Z. You're kind of splitting hairs. They're both really good. Neighbors is probably more of a Z slot guy. And then Thomas and A.D. Mitchell are going to look at being X's. I think Leggett right now is probably going to be more of a gadget guy. McConkey is probably going to be more of a Z slot. Worthy's probably going to be more of a Z slot because of that size. Like I just don't see him getting up there at 5'11", 165. He's going to have to roast people, and if you get up in his face, it's probably going to take that away. And the NFL, they can do stuff like that. Coleman is going to be an interesting prospect. I think he's raw and whatever. Pearsall. I mean, some of these guys can play the X if necessary, but they're probably going to translate to the NFL level as a Z slot. And I do like guys like Roman Wilson. Javon Baker is probably going to be the guy I would say has the best opportunity to be Puka if he gets the right landing spot. I like Jermaine Burton as that wide receiver 2. Potential range of outcomes. Johnny Wilson, Luke McCaffrey. So moving on to all this, I'm not going to too much waste all your time talking about the landing spots. Other than to say like San Francisco, you're looking at like best maybe the wide receiver 3 in that on that team. Which with Kittle there, that means you're looking at the 4. So probably not interested in anybody that goes there. The Bears, you're looking at a wide receiver 3. Bengals, you're looking at wide receiver 3. I was a little bit, when I was looking at this, I don't think that the Buffalo Bills actually are going to be bringing in a wide receiver. Dalton Kincaid can get moved around a little bit. I can see Khalil Shakur playing the Z. They brought in Matt Collins. He could play the X at 6'4", 221. Curtis Samuel can play like the Z slot. They just may not go out and get a guy. And so like from a landing spot perspective, like it may look better for us now than on draft day. If they go out and they get a guy, they may end up getting an X, which doesn't necessarily move the fantasy needle. It could, especially if they're going to try and make Khalil Shakur be the 1-to-1 replacement for Stephon Diggs. Let's see. Denver, you're looking at the quarterback situation. We already started out talking about that. Like even if a guy lands up there, they probably need more of a Z. I think I might have them pulled up. They need more of a Z in the offense, but without the quarterback to really land them there, like Cortland Sutton's probably more of an X. Josh Reynolds is probably more of an X. Tim Patrick's more of an X. Brandon Sim or Marvin Mims may be more of a slot. I don't even think Sean Payton likes him. And then you have the problem that there's no quarterback. So last year, apples to apples with Puka, Matt Stafford. So even if we get this year's Puka going to the Broncos, you're looking at Zach Wilson or Jarrett Stidham, giving him the football. I don't like that. that would mean that I'm definitely pushing him further and further down the board, even if there's possibility of opportunity going on with the Broncos this year. Let's see. Uh Browns, there isn't going to be an opportunity there. They have probably their top three wide receivers. They have a tight end. Even if I like the quarterback situation a little bit more with the Browns, and I'm wishy-washy with Deshaun Watson. Buccaneers, they have three wide receivers. They have a tight end. They have a receiving running back, and they have maybe an up in the air Baker May. Even if they bring a guy in, I think it's a tough road. The Cardinals, I do have the Cardinals pulled up. So right now, Michael Wilson would probably project to be the X, 62213. That is going to allow your Marvin Harrison to be the Z in the offense. They're going to have Trey McBride being like, the big slot or the Y. So overall, they can move Marvin Harrison around. From a fantasy perspective, I would probably give him like a third round grade because of the volatility, just expecting him to come in. Like, yeah, I think that he could jump in and compete right away going to the Cardinals. Even if I'm a little wishy-washy on Kyler Murray as a football player, I definitely could see that he could compete with 180 targets. Probably very safe to say that he's going to get in that 120 range to possibly cap out as like a mid-range wide receiver 2. So, I would feel very comfortable drafting him in the third round, but in the second round, it's going to get harder for him to return on the investment. That means that he's going to finish right away. If I was going to be projecting on that, like I think he's going to be projecting to finish as a top 10 wide receiver, and that's going to be a rough road. Again, trying to knock one of these guys out of the group. And again, if I'm looking at Puka 17.6 all the way down to about DK Metcalf being in the same tier, I'm probably going to go a different direction if the hype train and the ADP is a little too high for Marvin Harrison Jr. going to the Cardinals. All right. The Chargers. So this is a little interesting for me also. Palmer is probably better as a Z. He can play the X. Quentin Johnston should project as an X, probably is better as a Z. And then they have a lack of opportunity, especially because I'm not really concerned with the tight ends. So from a fantasy perspective, I'm expecting Malik Neighbors to go to the Chargers at 4 or 5, excuse me. And the big issue with that is he may be a little raw in certain regards. There may be some of the problems with the offense, with whatever Jim Harbaugh is going to do. I do like Justin Herbert. So again, it just ends up being like how far up the ADP ladder that good old Malik Neighbors is going to end up going. And I could definitely see him flirting probably in this sub range about like 150 to 100 targets. And again, so this would be a guy that like I probably would be looking at being more comfortable spending like a fourth round pick if that's where he goes to the Chargers overall. And again, I would be more interested in somebody else going to the Chargers and then spending less capital on than going up and overspending on a guy that's going to be in this wide receiver 2 range. Wide receiver 2s grow on trees. All right. Chiefs probably have their number 1, number 2, and number 3. So less interested in a guy necessarily going there. If the right guy goes late, I would potentially be looking at throwing a flyer, the cheapest guy going to a good offense. I think the Colts have their number 1, their number 2, and their 3 there. Maybe a higher rushing offense to begin with. Anthony Richardson, and don't really know what his passing totals are going to be. So even if a guy goes to the Colts, I might not be interested in them. The Redskins, on the other hand, it's going to be a lot more to do with quarterback situation. Because right now we're looking at who they have, Marcus Mariota. Like, I don't want anything to do with that. So from a wide receiver position, I expect that like McLaurin is better as a Z, and Dotson may be better as a slot, which would mean that like they would have to go out and spend capital on some type of X in the draft to potentially cap out in that like 100 target type range as a rookie. And with if we're expecting that they're going to go quarterback at 2, we're going to be expecting that the second round is where they would be looking to spend that capital on that position. And that's probably there probably aren't going to be some of those big X's on the board at that rate in the draft to really move the needle. So then you're looking at like some of the guys that theoretically could end up falling in the draft, because I think that the Redskins do have, with especially with Zach Ertz coming in, there may be an opportunity for the wide receiver 2 in that offense to get an opportunity to be fantasy relevant later on in the draft. And again, I'd be looking at like your Pearsalls and your Roman Wilsons, maybe Javon Baker, something like that, if they land there. Moving on, Cowboys, like CeeDee Lamb, Jake Ferguson, probably not going to be a guy to move the needle. Brandon Cooks. Dolphins is probably not going to have a guy with Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. Like you're looking at a guy being like wide receiver 3 in that offense. Same thing with the Eagles. You're looking at wide receiver 3. Falcons, maybe there's a wide receiver 2 there available, but with Kyle Pitts, like it's probably not going to happen. Again, you're looking at wide receiver 3. The Giants, I mean, first of all, like bad quarterback situation, so that doesn't tick that box. With Daniel Jones being there, I think there are worse quarterback situations, but overall, they need an X, because right now I would maybe guess that Isaiah Hodgins slots into the X, like Slayton may be the Z. Wan'Dale Robinson is going to be the slot. And then the guy that I'm more interested in all this offense, if what's his face, Darren Waller retires, is Daniel Bellinger. He's probably going to have the best return on investment. But the guy that I would be expecting that there's a possibility that he goes there is going to be Giants at 6, who is going to be Rome. And with that potential bad quarterback play to go along with, even if there's a lack of competition for targets, remember, best case scenario, we want a great player on an okay offense that doesn't have to compete for target or for opportunities. Well, in this case, everybody can take Rome away. So even if he goes there, I probably would still cap him out as value as like the 4th or 5th round pick at that point. Just not expecting him to be able to produce with the lack of talent on that offense. And then if some of these other guys go there later, they're going to have more interest to me, because I'm going to spend like nothing to find out. I'm not as concerned with Daniel Jones in that offense as much as the putting in the capital putting in too much capital to not get the return. And I'm looking for league winners. I'm not necessarily looking for this range of outcomes between like Puka to DK Metcalf, because I can go find those guys rather easily other points in the draft. Jaguars, this is another one that I was looking at, and I'm just not sure that a guy coming in, there's going to be a lot of mouths to feed. Parker Washington play like Z in slot. Kirk can actually play a little bit of X if necessary, but he's better as like a Z or a slot. They have Tim Jones, who can play like the X. Zay Jones is probably like a Z or an X. They brought in Gabe Davis probably specifically to play the X. They have Brenton Strange and Evan Ingram. So I talk about like the Packers having a lot of mouths to feed and a lot of like guys that are versatile within the offense if they need them to be this year. Even if the Jaguars bring in a rookie, it may not be the right rookie. So again, I want a guy to go to the Jaguars because there isn't an alpha there. And Trevor Lawrence may be good at football. I don't want the Jaguars to spend a good pick on this guy. I don't want them to spend a high-end pick. Again, I want these like middle round guys or some of the guys I like later on in the draft, like a Baker or Burton, to go to that team, because then I can throw a pick at a guy getting in this wide receiver 2 range when I'm not spending wide receiver 2 capital. The Jets. So right now with the Jets, we're looking at maybe Mike Williams being the X, Garrett Wilson's being the Z. There's a possibility of wide receiver 3 range of outcomes. Maybe Brock Bowers goes there as the tight end. Probably not going to move the needle too much from a fantasy perspective. Again, if they spend the right pick, the right capital on a guy later on, it's the right guy. There's a possibility of getting a wide receiver 2 in this offense, depending on the health of Mike Williams and how they're used overall. The other problem is Aaron Rodgers tends to just pepper a guy with targets. It might be Garrett Wilson, so there might not be enough to support a second guy anyway. The Lions, this is another one. They already have like 3 mouths to feed, 4 guys. The Sun God, Jameson Williams, Laporta, those running backs. Even if they spend a capital on this guy, you're looking at maybe the need for an X. If it falls far enough in the draft, that's going to be like really tough to go figure out. So like, yeah, I just don't know if the Detroit, even though I think they have an opportunity for that X in the offense, Donovan Peoples Jones would be that guy. I just don't know how much that rookie's going to come in and be able to get the targets that is going to move the needle for us to get into this like 120. So if you look at like Nico Collins last year with those injuries, 109 targets, 80 receptions, very efficient. That would be like what I would be wanting to slot into that Lions offense theoretically. And those guys that would do that in this draft, which would be like your Brian Thomas, your AD Mitchell. Rome's not going to be there. Like the Brian Thomas, AD Mitchell may fall a little bit in the draft. Those would be the guys that I would go, oh, that would be interesting if they fall far enough to the Lions. And then the ADP takes them out that they could maybe slot into a role to return on that investment. All right. Packers already talked about them. Too many mouths to feed. The Panthers, I'm expecting a step forward from Bryce Young. So buying a piece of what looks like to be a bad offense on the cheap is a good idea. Deontay Johnson probably going to play that Z. Maybe they need that big body speed guy in this offense. I definitely can see that happening. Here, I can maybe see they can get away with like a Xavier Worthy would be interesting, or a Roman Wilson. Like those two guys being there. Unfortunately, I think like maybe the range of outcomes on these guys is going to be a little bit capped as like a wide receiver 2. So we're not getting like that Puka, but that wide receiver 2 outside of say like round 7, the right guy landing there, that would be really interesting. The right speed guy. Looking at the Patriots moving forward, I think the Patriots are next. The Patriots, on the other hand, like I don't want anything to do with this offense. I don't really care who goes there. You're looking at like a 13th round pick. Right now, it's Jacoby Brissett, I think, is supposed to be the starting quarterback for them. Yeah, Jacoby Brissett. I don't like any of the wide receivers. I don't really like the tight ends. They need an X. They need probably a Z and a slot. Maybe they have like a couple of like okay like Z slot type guys. They don't have a Z. Overall, like it doesn't meet the criteria of being a part of a good offense. We can't project that. Maybe they go out and they pull the trigger on a quarterback in this draft at 3. And again, without a good offensive line and without weapons, it's going to make it very difficult. So probably certain guys that go later in the draft are going to be more valuable from a fantasy perspective than if the Patriots actually go out and spend on a guy. All right. Raiders, Devontae Adams, probably going to push a lower volume passing offense, probably going to push the range of outcomes. They have like Michael Mayer, they have Trey Tucker, Jacoby Myers. I'm not interested probably in anything going to the Raiders early. Maybe something later can eat into a role. The Rams, I mean, Puka and Cooper Kupp, I'm not going to be interested in them too much. The Ravens are going to be a little interesting. So expecting that Zay Flowers is going to be able to take a step forward, and maybe Mark Andrews is not going to be quite the guy. I was listening to somebody talk about like his average after the target was down this last year before the injury. Rashad Bateman maybe slots in as that X, probably better as a Z. That's also the same role that like I would expect like Zay Flowers to be able to roll with. Don't necessarily see that position. So if the Ravens go out and they take an X, there's a possibility that guy could slot in and get into that. If I can pull this up, get into that Nico Collins type of range in this offense. If they go up and they trade for one of these guys like your Brian Robinson Jr. Or your AD Mitchell, I don't think they're going to be able to have the draft capital to go up and get Rome, something like that. Like that would be interesting to go up and speculate on one of those guys going there. But overall, like it's going to be a rough road for that. Let's see. The Saints, they're going to have Olave to start off with. So you're looking at like probably a guy slotting in to be the wide receiver 2 in that offense. There's a possibility that they could go out and they could get someone else to be that alpha. I think Chris Olave is probably better as a 2. So maybe they could go out and they could get a guy like that could play that Z that could get moved around the formation, and that would maybe raise my interest if they go out and they get a guy later in the draft. And again, like the guys that I'm tracking in this draft, like Javon Baker is a guy I'd be really interested on going to a team like that, potentially being able to slot in and be more of a well-rounded player. Let's see. Seattle, there's too many mouths to feed, more than likely going to be there. Pittsburgh's going to be really interesting because with Russell Wilson possibly being there, and then George Pickens. George Pickens is probably better as an X than a Z. They lost Deontay Johnson. So there's a possibility that like some of these guys that like we really like, your Ricky Pearsalls and your Lad McConkey going to the Steelers, and it's probably going to cost them draft capital. They tend not to spend draft capital on some of these guys. Like that would be a little interesting to me because now we can start projecting that guy up into that like 120, 150 target role. It allows George Pickens to play the X, and then the guy that they would theoretically bring in to replace Deontay Johnson would play the Z. That would be something and to speculate on in the draft. Let's see. Texans, we already talked about like there's going to be a lot of mouths to feed there. Tennessee, I don't think between Ridley, Chig, and DeAndre Hopkins, I don't think there's going to be a guy there. And obviously, there's not going to be a lot of mouths, or there's going to be too many mouths to feed in with the Vikings. So overall, like we're trying to push certain guys down the board. Luke McCaffrey would be a guy that I think would be interesting. Burton in the right offense, Javon Baker going to the right situation where he could be the number one, that Z. And then outside of that, like your Lad McConkeys or your Ricky Pearsalls, if they're going to play that like Z slot in an offense that there's going to be things opened up. More than likely, your value is not going to come from your Marvin Harrison Jr., even though I think he's going to be like a really good pick going to the Cardinals. And then Neighbors may end up being a really good pick going to the Chargers if they go there. Rome may end up going to a really good landing spot from an opportunity standpoint with the Giants, except for the quarterback and the lack of other weapons that keep coverage away from them. I think Thomas and Mitchell are going to be a little limited. I definitely think that Leggett's going to be a gadget guy this year. So you're looking at like more value from some of these guys, like Worthy going to the right offense and being like a vertical player could get it, even though they're like entirely different. I pull them up, even though like Nico and Worthy are entirely different players, they could end up being used like statistically similar. Coleman, I don't think maybe isn't going to be fantasy relevant. Roman Wilson, maybe. I don't really like Troy Franklin overall. And that would be about it. So, like, again, we're looking at the guy that goes to the best situation with the least amount of capital that we have to put in to find out. That would be the idea. And then some of the other guys, like they might end up at really good landing spots, like your Marvin Harrison Jr. Or your Malik Neighbors. Those guys are going to get pushed up the board. But they're also going to have the ability to get hype trained up and not return on my investment. So yeah, that's kind of my overview for the landing spots going on for the rookie draft that's coming up as I kind of crack my voice. So overall, I kind of only have good landing spots. We're looking at the Cardinals. That's probably going to be Marvin Harrison Jr. The Chargers, whether or not it's Neighbors at 5. The Giants, I don't really think is a good landing spot overall. Panthers are probably going to have a possibility of the best landing spot out of everybody. And then if a Z goes to the Steelers, that would be really interesting also. So yeah, I'll hopefully tomorrow I'm going to do the running backs, and then I'll probably combine tight ends and quarterbacks because I just don't think there's too many of those guys to talk about going into Thursday's draft. And then like Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday will probably be like all stuff all day long. So yeah,